The murder trial of Derek Chauvin is on day 9 of witness testimony. The former Minneapolis police officer is accused of killing George Floyd after kneeling on his neck for more than 9 minutes last May. Today, the jury heard from a medical expert who testified as to what precisely led to Floyd's death. Dr. Dr Tobin, a pulmonologist who specializes in how people breathe. He testified Floyd died from a low level of oxygen that caused damage to his brain and led to an arrhythmia that caused his heart to stop. Dr. Tobin says it happened because of a low level of oxygen caused by shallow breathing. Prosecutors asked Dr. Tobin for the cause of this shallow breathing.
What happened in the case of Mr. Floyd that relates to the shallow breathing that resulted in his low oxygen?
So there are a number of forces that led to that the size of his breath became so small. And so there are a series of forces higher up that are leading to that. And the main forces that are going to lead to the shallow breath are going to be that he's turned prone on the street, that he has the handcuffs in place combined with the street, and then that he has a knee on his neck, and then that he has a knee on his back and on his side. All of these 4 forces are ultimately going to result in the low tidal volume, which gives you the shallow breaths that we saw here.
Kirk Burkhalter is a professor at New York Law School and a former New York Police Department detective. He joins me from New York City. Kirk, welcome. Great to have you with us. So what is the prosecution's goal in bringing forth this particular medical expert? Did we learn anything specific today about Floyd's cause of death that can be directly linked to Chauvin's actions?
Well, Tanya, this very much is the meat of the prosecution's case. So initially, we've seen a lot of testimony and a lot of emotional testimony about the use of force and the bystander testimony and so forth. However, the prosecution must prove causation. There are 2 hurdles the defense must or rather 2 things the prosecution must prove: that Derek Chauvin was not justified in the use of force, and given the use of force and the fact that he was not justified, he caused the death of George Floyd, meaning he was a substantial cause. So here, the doctor's testifying basically that, yes, the actions that Derek Chauvin took were a substantial cause. He flat out said that George Floyd died because of this lack of oxygen, and the lack of oxygen was caused by the knee to the neck of George Floyd. And he went through great detail about the amount of time due to that lack of oxygen and what would be the result. He also testified about the fact that when and if someone can speak, even if they are lacking oxygen. So the fact that it takes, you can speak if you have oxygen inside your body. However, it takes one has to inhale more oxygen to continue to speak. And this rebuts that proposition that the defense has set forth, that because George Floyd was speaking, screaming for his life or pleading for his life, he was not losing oxygen.
Absolutely. And, you know, the prosecution spent considerable time discussing Dr. Tobin's credentials and making clear that he was not paid and has never been involved in a criminal trial. Why does the state believe that that's an important piece of information for the jury to hear?
Oh, it's very critical because this trial is likely to come down to a battle, what we call a battle of the experts. So the defense certainly will have experts that they have paid to be present. They will also utilize expertise that they did not pay, for instance, the coroner for this jurisdiction. So it's important for the prosecution to show that this person was not paid to be here, and therefore they would not have an improper motive or a motive just to please the prosecution. You know, the theory being that this person was objective, and therefore the jury can actually rely on the information that he's providing. But make no mistake about it, this case is probably going to turn on, 1, the cause of death factor, and 2, which experts the jury chooses to believe.
And we did hear Dr. Tobin give a very detailed explanation of his determination into how George Floyd died. I'm going to play one example from his testimony, and we do want to warn our viewers who haven't been watching the trial closely. Some of these details are graphic. Let's listen.
you see his knuckle against the tire. And to most people, this doesn't look terribly significant, but to a physiologist, this is extraordinarily significant, because this tells you that he has used up his resources and he is now literally trying to breathe with his fingers and knuckles. Because when you begin to breathe with your rib cage and your diaphragm. The next thing you recruit after that is your sternomastoid muscle, which is the big muscle in your neck. And then when those are wasted up, then you're relying on these types of muscles, like your fingers, to try and stabilize your whole right side.
It's just devastating to hear that sort of testimony. And when you look at the big picture, you know, how important is it for the jury to hear these specific details, these tiny little details, which, you know, give you a full picture as to what George Floyd was experiencing in those crucial 9 minutes? How do these medical distinctions by the doctor help the prosecution's case?
Well, this is huge because the jury is going to have access to the video and all other evidence. And this is pointing, giving the jury direction as to what aspects of the video they should pay attention to. Obviously, they should pay attention to all the bystander information, video, and the what Chauvin did. However, by the doctor pointing out these intricate facts, what tends to lead him to believe that someone is struggling for air, the usage of the fingers. You know, if you think about if you've ever been confined in any way, shape, or form, or you were stuck somewhere and you start gyrating with your body, you start using everything. So this is very relatable for the jury. However, the doctor's putting it in extremely discrete scientific terms. So he's a very credible witness because he provided his credentials. He provided the fact that he wasn't being paid, and he's able to methodically go through this video and point out to the jury each and every piece that indicates that at some point while George Floyd was confined and restrained, that he was grasping for air. And then if we move on further, it was likely that he was asphyxiated well before Derek Chauvin released his knee from his neck. So he's a critical witness, very credible. I think the prosecution is doing a nice job here with him.
And Dr. Tobin often used his hands to sort of describe what was happening to George Floyd. And at one point, the defense objected, and the judge did tell the jurors they did not have to mimic the doctor's movements. What do you make of the objection, and why do you think the judge issued that warning?
Well, that was very interesting. So if I'm the defense, I'm going to object also. And it kind of shows that the defense believes that this doctor is very credible and the jury is believing him. After all, many people, when you use your hands to emphasize a particular point, that's much more powerful than when you remain static. And certainly, you know, at some points he pointed to his neck where George Floyd was, where he had the knee and so forth. So that was huge. And by the judge mentioned, okay, the jury does not have to pay attention to that. However, it's very difficult sometimes to unring the bell. The damage was already done. I'm sure that had some influence on the jury. And once again, I hate to constantly repeat myself, but it added to his credibility. You know, it's like he's teaching a class and the jury are his students and they are a captive audience.
But wouldn't he be doing his job there if he's trying to describe the physiology of what's happening in a person's body as they are essentially suffocating? Wouldn't that be okay to show the physicality of it? Because that's what he's trying to describe. Why on a legal basis would there be any grounds for an objection to that?
So the only legal basis I can think of is that well, for one, first of all, if you are a defense attorney and there's a witness on the stand and that witness is hurting your case, you object. You find a way to object. You find a manner to kind of stop the bleeding. Second, the main argument I would think of is that this would be unduly prejudicial. So his mimicking the movements, in other words, the jury already has a video, so they don't need someone to come in and reenact the video physically. They can simply opine on what they see. So I would think that would be the basis of the objection, that was unduly prejudicial. The judge made this ruling that, you know, the jury could choose to ignore it. They are not bound to ignore it. But in a way, that ruling is not necessary because juries are allowed to agree with information, to disagree with information, to challenge the veracity of information. They have that choice already. So the judge was merely stating what they can do already. So in effect, that limiting ruling wasn't necessary.
And we did see yesterday the defense try to use or tie Floyd's alleged drug use to his death. Dr. Tobin said that even a fully healthy person would have died under similar circumstances. But do you expect the defense to keep that strategy up with the prosecution's medical experts?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So the defense has to, well, they don't have to prove, they simply have to sow a reasonable doubt in the jury that Derek Chauvin was the substantial cause of death. And they're going to do that by constantly hammering home this prior drug usage and the fact that drugs were in the car and that in some way, shape, or form, this contributed to the death of George Floyd in a substantial factor, less than the knee on the neck. So this is very much the crux of the defense's case, to rebut the evidence for causation. And the only way they can rebut that evidence is by presenting this drug usage. The problem here is it comes dangerously close to putting the victim on trial. George Floyd is A, not on trial, and B, he's not on trial for using drugs at some point in the past. So the defense does run the risk of kind of overusing this tactic. At some point, the jury will, perhaps it becomes white noise, right? And the jury's heard it over and over, and they'll disregard it and just look at the video and just look at what everyone else in the country has seen.
All right. Well, Professor Kirk Burkhalter of New York Law School, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
My pleasure.